Welcome back to our channel. Help us print our next issue by buying us a coffee. Thank you for supporting Archetype.
I'm Robert Price, and the title of the story I wrote is Doozyville.
And will you tell us a little bit about what Doozyville is? Just a short glimpse of piece.
Doozyville is a story about a cartoonist who watches as what is funny in his cartoon is not as funny or as absurd as what happens to his neighborhood.
I really like that it is kind of faced in a way where there's different perspectives coming up. This like subtlety where the narrator is showing his opinion in, but you can definitely see like the outburst from the community. It's a very community centered piece, which I really, really enjoy.
Usually when I sit down to write, I usually don't have any particular goal or plan. And this one I kind of came up with for no particular reason. I don't remember what I was doing. We put our son to bed and I sat down and I had this idea that in the story, the cartoonist has some cartoon ideas. And I wrote down one of his little cartoon ideas. And then I kept writing and I ended up with that full story. You know, it's not very allegorical. It's, if you read the news these days, you see similar things transpiring. In this story, at least, the trade-off was kind of the absurd. I took the story about as far as it could go without it turning into science fiction.
No, I really like that. This trade-off necessary for deciding how things are run.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it plays. I see it down in the States, you know, and I wrote this a while ago. Down in the U.S., there, you know, I saw in the news that Florida had flown some people up into Martha's Vineyard, and then the Martha Vineyard is kind of like this perfect place. It's beautiful, preserved. It's a beautiful place. And when this plane load of, I don't know, Mexicans or Venezuelans showed up, within 24 hours they had them removed. But they did it with smiles on their face because they wanted to keep their place. I think sometimes when you're looking at the world, one of the ways that you can make sense of it is just to interpret it back to yourself in a song or in a dance or in a story or in a movie. I, like a lot of people, just kind of talk to myself by writing a story.
Besides it being perhaps a little bit political, I see like a lot of just seeing how human nature is. You know, this is really how people react. It is a little bit on the absurdity, but I can definitely see this having played out in the world, and seeing from this side was really.
Yeah. Well, I used to live in Toronto. I lived for many years out on the east side. It's not a very wealthy neighborhood. I mean, when I moved in there, Shooter Street is a dump. And the city of Toronto thought it was a good idea to put safe injection sites. And I think there was 3 of them. I know there was 2 of them, but I think there was 3 of them in a very, very close, you know, in a little corner pocket of the city, in my old neighborhood, because you don't want people dying from drug overdoses, is the rationale. So we will help them shoot up safely. And so we will have 3 shoot up zones in my neighborhood. And then there's needles everywhere. And I take my kid walking and there's needles outside our apartment, and there's needles in the park, and there's somebody sets the slide, you know, the tower where the little kids slide, they set it on fire, and there's needles and excrement. And so this is the funny thing, the thing that I think is strange, because I know, you know, having lived in that neighborhood, there's people who say we need to do more. And I say, no, it's horrible to go walking on New Year's Day, as we did down around Jarvis and Adelaide. There's this empty parking lot, and it was like you're looking at a field of poppies, except they're not poppies, and they're not red, they're orange. They're the orange caps from the needles. And there must have been thousands of them. Like, they must have had a huge party there shooting up. And, you know, so you try to do the right thing, but people are complicated and can end up doing a lot of damage.
How about we talk about your writing process? Do you have a typical writing process you like to share, or the story in particular? How do you go about writing a story?
So I do lots of different kinds of writing. I do a lot of freelance and trade writing. So stuff that nobody would ever read. It's, I wrote an article in a biotech magazine about some professor who's figured out a way to chop up crystallized proteins, right? It's things that nobody really will read. Is really for a rarefied audience. And I make a bit of money doing that. And that process is very industrial and maximize my time, get it done as fast as I can. With the other things, this, writing stories, my process has changed as I've gotten older. When I was young, I used to write everything longhand, and I have these old notebooks of all these old stories and novels. And then I got into a habit, and every morning I'd leave my house because I couldn't really work at home. And I was commuting to work. So I'd leave the house, go get a cup of tea, sit in a coffee shop, and I'd write. And I would write nonstop. And I did that every day for a couple of decades and produced all kinds of stuff that no one will ever see. And that was satisfying. I enjoyed just doing that work. That was a hobby. But my life changed. Got married, had a child. And you can't do that very easily. And I found that I didn't really want to do it. I'd much rather spend time with my son and my wife, my family. Now, when I sit down to work, instead of writing in the morning, now I'll write maybe in the evening after he goes to bed. And instead of writing 2,000 words a day, I'll satisfied with 400 words. Maybe I'll write something, with my thumbs on my phone.
What inspires you to continue writing now, even in those 15 minutes when really for us seems so small, but for you to complete, that the long piece you were talking about is sufficient.
It's a bit of a habit. Maybe it's a bad habit. The other day, I wrote just a few lines of a poem, just killing time before a class, and I write them in Google Draft generally. I have my notebook and I'll write things in my notebook, but then, when you've always got your phone and I'm killing time. So I make notes to myself, and I wrote this little note. And then the other day I was looking at it, and I saw, like, okay, it could turn into a sonnet. I could kind of imagine it. So then it was like, it's kind of like doing a Wordle. I really like Wordle, where you try to find the word in this sequence, right?
Dude, I was actually playing it yesterday.
Yeah.
Like,
And so I look at this draft, this little fragment, and I see the potential for a sonnet. So then it's kind of a game to see if I can put together a little sonnet.
it's interesting. It seems like writing is more part of your lifestyle than it is. People usually take saying, okay, I'm gonna schedule out exactly when I'm gonna write. I'm gonna sit down at my desk, write for an hour, but it's more like that's constantly in your mind, or it's something that you go in and out of. It's interesting. And I think it's actually a very good habit if you want to get into writing.
Writing is thinking. Writing is talking. Writing is questioning and seeking for an answer. Derek Walcott says, poetry is prayer. It's the same idea that, it's like, it's just part of a way of talking to oneself, or talking up. But I just, I'm thinking about something. And what do you do when you think about it? Well, I'll just tell somebody, and I write it down. If you do it long enough, you start, you're able to write without looking at your fingers, right? And writing is the kind of thing that you can do. It's not like you're a woodworker and you're just like, then you got to go to the studio and get some wood and chop it up. Or painting, you got to, set up your stand. But, dancers will just kind of dance around the house, and singers sing when they talk. And there's ways that you kind of express, and it just kind of becomes part of your thing, right?
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true. People are not realizing that it's especially when you're young, you aim for this thing and then you grow up and you realize it might not be as you thought it would be. I have a
Yeah.
question for you
Yeah.
then. What do you think the future of Canadian publishing, or publishing in general, would look like, in your opinion?
I really have no idea. I don't know. In Canada, publishing has always been small. Years ago, I used to edit a magazine called Canadian Bookseller. It was publication of the Canadian Independent Booksellers Association. And I interviewed a whole bunch of people. I was speaking to one of the guys that ran a fairly well-known mid-level publishing outfit in Canada. I won't say the name, but you'd know it. And he was telling me, he'd been in publishing, 30, 40 years. And he says, it's always been a cottage industry in Canada, and it always will be. Most of the publishing in Canada happens in Canada is supported through government grants. Almost all of the journals, except for enterprising, smart journals like Archetype, are supported by government, right? Because there's just not an audience for it. Like I say, to be a bestseller in Canada, you sell 5,000 copies. 5,000 copies doesn't make the writer hardly anything. I don't even think the publisher breaks even on that, It's not much. So publishing in Canada is always going to be small. It's probably more influential than it is in its size, right? But it's a cottage industry, and that allows for certain freedoms because you can ideally just do whatever you want, say whatever you want, right? And it's always the case too that if somebody becomes big enough in Canada, well, they're going to go to the bigger theater. They're going to go down to the States. So if you're a good scriptwriter, well, you're going to go to the States. If you're a big novelist, you're probably not going to stay with a Canadian publisher. You're going to go down to the big New York publishers and everything, funny comedian, you're going to go down to the States. So Canada is always going to bleed its talent south to the bigger theater, and that's probably a good thing, right? Good thing for the artists, and that's how it is. Because Canada's small. But, it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of good things happening. I think one of the best things that has happened to writing in the last, 28 months has been the advent of Substack. Substack is a great platform. Writers can publish in a way that is it looks professional. It's very user-friendly, and it has a subscription model. So a writer can get paid for what they're doing. If you look at the stats, not many writers make much, right? But there are people, I subscribe to them. I pay money for subscriptions, and I see and read about writers saying that they're inching up, maybe they can make a living doing this. They've got a niche, they're doing their reporting. So, it's not all doom and gloom. There'll still be great novels published.
Talking about this, actually, I'll say writing instructor. Do you have any tips particularly like to share for new writers or just writers who are kind of seeing like where they should go in terms of either writing process, writing style, or just putting their work out there?
Well, no, so I do work as a writing teacher. And I've taught all levels. And I know I don't want to put myself out of business, but in some ways it's not that hard. Like the rules, the way to kind of get ahead as a writer, it's not that complicated. You just have to write every single day and read a lot.
It's really inspiring, to be honest. I'm right up and straying from writing just because life gets in the way, work and other duties, but taking the time to invest it into your lifestyle, and really it is so simple. You just need to do it.
You need to do it.
Yeah.
If you don't have a kid, then you've got time. You can wake up at 5 a.m. and write for an hour. You can give yourself a quota that you're going to do 800 words every morning or whatever, and then do that for 10 years. And it comes second nature.
Yeah.
Maybe you publish some things that you like, but I've said this to many people. So I have students come to me and say they want to do an MFA. They'll do an MFA. There's good reasons to do an MFA because an MFA will give you a network, put you in touch with some really good mentors, right? And I know some people who've had some real success because they did an MA. I mean, it's not only because, but it helped them, right? It was kind of like a contribution to their success. But I know many more people, most people who do an MFA get almost nothing out of it, right? Like you don't see that they're not bestsellers. They're not, maybe not even publishing after that, right? So what I say to some people is like, students, I say, so how much is an MFA going to cost you in terms of tuition plus lost income? If you're going to do a 2-year MFA or a 1-year MFA, let's say $60,000, right? Lost income because you're not working, and then everything else, $60,000. So what can you do with $60,000? You can move to a farm in Nova Scotia where the rent is very cheap, and you can probably over the course of 2 years write 4 or 5 novels. The first 4 will be horrible and you'll just destroy, but the 5th one might be really good. Or maybe you don't go for 2 years, you go for 1 year, and then you hire a really good editor to help you work through the 2 manuscripts that you wrote during the year that you spent on a farm, right? So why do an MFA? Well, because it has a network and it's connected. And, there is a whole kind of MFA writing community out there, right? I mean, I don't read any of the stuff really, but it's out there. And if you want to be in there, then you got to get in there. But, you just want to write a blog, get really good at it, and do interviews or whatever. Just go up to I said Nova Scotia, and I know that Allie's from Nova Scotia, but like live out on the farm. Like, I don't know. There's places you can rent for $500 a month and just kind of write. And, so that's what you do with $60,000.
I love that. And honestly, side note, me and Allie, we went to Nova Scotia last summer, and it was so peaceful, and it was so like we were both like in different jobs, and that's what really inspired us to do Archetype. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, I hope some of it's useful, and I hope I don't sound too much like an angry old man.
No, not at all.
Or the cynic.
Honestly inspired me a lot today. I'm going back to writing.
Good.
For sure.
Okay. Right on. Okay.